In sentences that contain both a dependent or subordinate clause and an independent clause, it is important to select the correct tenses. Two or more actions need to be put in the correct relationship with each other. Here are 3 rules for sequence of tenses in subordinate clauses. What is a subordinate clause? A subordinate clause or dependent clause is a clause that cannot stand alone as a complete sentence because it does not express a complete thought. On the other hand, the independent clause does express a complete thought and can stand alone. Think about it like this. Does this clause make sense without additional information? Here's an example. I began to write a travel blog after I started grammar class. In this example, there are 2 clauses. I began to write a travel blog and after I started grammar class. Does I began to write a travel blog make sense with no additional information? Yes, it does. This is the main clause of the sentence. Does after I started grammar class make sense with no additional information? No, it doesn't. We need to know after what. This is the subordinate clause. The verb tense in this clause will change depending on the verb tense in the independent or main clause. Let's look at another example. Before I started studying grammar, I lacked confidence. Before I started studying grammar is clause 1. I lacked confidence is clause 2. Does before I started studying grammar make sense with no additional information? No, it doesn't. This is the subordinate clause. Does I lacked confidence make sense on its own with no additional information? Yes, it does. This is the main clause. The verb tense in this clause will determine the verb tense in the subordinate clause. We need to determine the verb tense of the main clause and modify the verb tense of the subordinate clause accordingly. If the sequence of time is not accurate, the sentence will not be correct. Worse, it may not even make sense. Rule 1. If the main clause is in the present tense, then the subordinate clause can be in the past, the present perfect, the present continuous, or the future. For example, the main clause is in the present tense, I know. The verb in the second clause can be in the past tense, I know that you thought about it. Or in the present perfect, I know that you have thought about it. Or in the present, I know that you think about it. In the present continuous, I know that you are thinking about it. In the future, I know that you will think about it. If the subordinate clause is in the past tense, the action described in the subordinate clause took place first. If the subordinate clause is in the present perfect tense, the action described in the subordinate clause took place at an indefinite time before that of the main clause. If the subordinate clause is in the present tense, both actions are simultaneous and ongoing. If the subordinate clause is in the present continuous tense, both actions are simultaneous and occurring right now. If the subordinate clause is in the future tense, the action described in the subordinate clause will take place after the action in the main clause. Rule 2. If the verb in the main clause is in the past tense, the verb in the subordinate clause can be in the past continuous, or the past perfect. For example, she visited our home. The verb in the main clause is in the past tense. The verb in the subordinate clause can also be in the past tense. She visited our home when she stayed in London. It can be in the past continuous. She visited our home when she was visiting London. It can also be in the past perfect. She visited our home after she had visited London. If the subordinate clause is in the past tense or the past continuous tense, then it means the actions were simultaneous. If the subordinate clause is in the past perfect tense, then it means the action described in the subordinate clause happened first, and the action in the main clause happened second. Rule 3. If the verb in the main clause is in the future tense, then the verb in the subordinate clause can be in the future tense or the future past. For example, the verb in the main clause is in the future tense. I will play tennis. The verb in the subordinate clause can be in the present tense. I will play tennis when the rain stops, or the future past. I will play tennis if the rain would stop. In both cases, the action in the subordinate clause occurs first. After it occurs, the action in the main clause will take place. Now you know everything there is to know about the sequence of verb tenses in subordinate clauses.